President Joe Biden participates in the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit held in Washington, D.C. Yes, December 2022. As a matter of fact, on the 15th of December 2022, he gives his remarks and promises, prospects for the future, and whatnot. This is a continuation from a video that we made a few days ago regarding this summit. Go ahead and click on the link, which should be in the description of this video, to the previous video where we talked about the concept of the summit, why it took 8 years since the last summit, which was held by President Barack Obama, okay, in 2014, up to this point. Why the inconsistency in the U.S. policy, and why United States is far behind of China when it comes to engagement, cooperation, and economic cooperation at the end of the day, right? Which is very important, trade and what have you, compared to China. Okay, but today we will be focusing on the remarks by President Joe Biden. So go back and watch that particular video, the previous one. But December 15, 2020, President Joe Biden announces several commitments and investments for Africa during the remarks at the leaders session of the U.S. Africa Summit in Washington, D.C. The president reiterated the U.S. support for Africa Union joining the G20. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along here. Okay, African Union joining the G20. In addition, he said the U.S. is committed more than 55 billion, I believe is the exact number. We'll talk a little bit more about that in spending in Africa. He also said he'd be asking Congress to loan the International Monetary Fund 21 billion for Africa. Okay, well, let's begin with President Joe Biden's remarks about the future, okay, about the future and where America and Africa can go together. Let's listen.
And with this summit and with the African Union's Agenda 2063, our eyes are fixed squarely on the future. We're now in the early years that will be a decisive decade. The choices that we make today and the remainder of this decade and how we tackle these challenges, in my view, will determine the direction the entire world takes in the decades to come. As I said yesterday.
Okay. Talking about the future. Now, just a little bit of analysis and perhaps some projection on the fact of what he just said. Okay, the fact is he said what he said and we just heard it. Some projection here would be that, well, he's talking about the future because the U.S. cannot talk about the past. The U.S. cannot talk with confidence, that is, about the past. The recent past with regards to U.S. investment, U.S. cooperation, U.S. trade with Africa, U.S. focus on Africa has nothing to say. So it's nice to talk about 2063 and the future and the decades ahead and the choices that we will make and whatnot. But the past is not something that the U.S. can speak with a lot of confidence about. So now let's get into the aspect of the African Union joining the AU. The African Union joining the G20, which, by the way, is like, well, what took so long and what's the deal with that? Let's listen to it.
The entire world takes in the decades to come. As I said yesterday, the United States is all in on Africa and all in with Africa. African voices, African leadership, African innovation, all are critical to addressing the most pressing global challenges and to realizing the vision we all share. A world that is free, a world that is open, prosperous, and secure. Africa belongs to the table in every room where global challenges are being discussed, and in every institution we're discussing.
Okay, so we're hearing now in 2022 that Africa belongs in the room. What the hell? We're like, okay. That sounds almost like an insult, in my opinion. Like, well, yeah, we think Africa should come join the G20, the African Union. Africa belongs in every room. What the hell are you talking about?
Discussions are taking place. That's why I announced in September at the United Nations General Assembly that the United States fully supports reforming the UN Security Council to include permanent representation for Africa. And today I'm also calling for the African Union to join the G20 as a permanent member of the G20.
Fully supports, calling for. Okay, these are things that should have happened decades ago, in my opinion.
Whether it's been a long time in coming, but it's going to come. And
Exactly,
today I'm
Joe. Long
also,
time.
whether we're upholding or defending the foundation principles of global peace and security enshrined in the UN Charter and the UN and in the AU's seminal documents, or meeting the challenges that impact every nation.
Well, Mr. African Union here doesn't look too happy about it.
The people of Africa are indispensable partners delivering the progress that benefits everyone, not just in Africa and the United States, but the whole world. The COVID-19 pandemic,
Okay.
the direction.
So we get the picture. We get the picture. The U.S. is saying basically that it supports and it's proposing that the African Union, okay, the whole of the African Union, that is not any one particular country, join the G20, okay, and saying, well, it makes sense because, Africa belongs on the table, Africa is in blah, 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 institutions where things are being discussed. But this is not necessarily the attitude on the ground with regards to how the United States treat African nations. As a matter of fact, there's something about this summit, and as we mentioned in our previous video, why it took 8 years. And you can talk about the Republican administrations whom kind of pull the rug from under the progress that is made by President Barack Obama. But Barack Obama held the first summit in 2014. He did not hold the second one in 15, right? He did not hold the preceding ones, 15 or 16. Okay, so this is not just a question of Republican, Democrat. This is an American attitude towards Africa, and there's a lot of patronizing tone when President Biden says Africa belongs at the table. But let's get into this 55 billion. Let's talk about the 55 billion, okay? And by contrast, Chinese investments in Africa are about 250 billion so far. 5 times more than this 55 billion for a continent of 54 nations, where some nations like the Congo are larger than the entirety of Western Europe.
But that doesn't change our shared goals and our commitment to seeing them through. It only makes it more urgent for us to take decisive action and take it together. That's why over the next 3 years, working in close cooperation with the United States Congress, we plan to commit $55 billion in Africa to advance the priorities we share and to support the Agenda 2063. That number represents a comprehensive commitment from the United States to invest in Africa's people, Africa's infrastructure, Africa's agriculture, Africa's health system, Africa's security, and more.
People, infrastructure, health structure, security, and what have you. Okay, so let's continue here with the 55 billion. Again, 55 billion for a nation of 54 nations is really nothing. It's a drop in the bucket, right? Let's continue.
In our view, our new shared vision statement lays out a forward-looking foundation for the 21st century partnership between Africa and the United States. We want to work with you on these issues that matter most to our people's lives. And we're looking to increase our collaboration in every area, from rural communities to urban centers to cyberspace to outer space. In addition to our investments, we're also committed to helping African countries assess the financing you need to build sustainable and inclusive economies.
So, again, this is a drop in the bucket, right? 55 billion is not much. And making it seem as though it was a handout is also another part of the patronizing aspect of things. The way that you build economic cooperation with your neighbor, for example, it's not by just telling your neighbor, oh, you know what, I'm going to donate to you guys, $40 this Christmas season. Okay, the way you get it done is you and your neighbor have joint interests, which will be as a matter of fact, is the case as long as we're living in a world together and the world continues to globalize. So you have joint interests and you say, hey, Mr. Neighbor, we have to build a fence. I noticed that you are particularly skilled in this area. I'm skilled in this area. Okay, I'm going to do the financing and you bring in the labor. Okay, where do we get the tools? Let's combine our efforts to get the tools from the next village over, and let's create a contract between ourselves. Let's make it a LLC versus an S Corp and whatnot. What am I saying here? I'm saying something that I often repeat, which is in order to create these lasting institutions, they have to come from the ground up as a result of actual cooperation on real world things. You and your neighbor building the fence will then lead to a structure of a relationship between you and your neighbor. You cannot, from the top down, define a structure, okay? And then just give lip service to building the fence. The fence will never get built, is the point here. You don't know what the structure should be, but you get in there and you say, what are our joint interests? What have you got? What have I got? What can you do? What can I do? Where do we get the funds? Where do we get the labor? Whom do we borrow the money from? What kind of a corporate structure, as a result, do we need to make this contract happen? And then the contracts, the institutions, the structures move forward, which will enable future cooperations of this sort. That's how it happens. It's not top down, and it's not, oh, let me give you $40 for Christmas. That's not how it works. But regarding money, if we continue on the topic of money, the IMF is something else that President Biden talked about. So there's a separate 21 billion outside of the 55 billion, which he mentioned. There's a separate 21 million, which he's going to ask Congress to loan out to the IMF to help with loans. And we'll give a comment on that. Let's see.
We're leading a global effort to pursue equitable arrangements for global creditors to provide debt relief so nations can prioritize their people, not backbreaking debt payments. And I'm asking the Congress for the authority to lend $21 billion to the International Monetary Fund to provide access to necessary financing for low and middle income countries, which is so difficult to come by now, and so will help Africa's recovery efforts and support projects that build resilience against future crises.
Okay, IMF and IMF loans. We have to say a couple of words about that, because the IMF loans, like any loan, any kind of financial entanglement that you get in with, is going to come with terms, right? It's going to come with terms. You go to the bank, you say, I want a loan. And then they say, here are the terms. This is the interest rate. This is how long it takes to pay back. Okay. Those are just two simple terms, but we understand that terms come with deals. A lot of the terms that come with the IMF deals are about you doing things in the way that the West wants you to do them, especially when it comes to the greening of things. In other words, you cannot use that kind of fertilizer. You have to do agriculture in a sustainable way. You cannot quote unquote pollute. Okay. You cannot manufacture your own chocolate, products in your own country, because, you have to buy carbon credits from us. Okay. The collapse of the Sri Lankan economy that recently happened was in large part due to the IMF loans that they took. They took loans from the IMF, billions and billions of dollars. Great. And the IMF told them, hey, you have to do your agriculture in a quote unquote sustainable, green, woke way. The IMF money always comes with some sustainable, green, woke agenda that you have to follow and that you cannot meet as a developing nation. The sustainable, green, woke thing is when you're already at the penthouse. When you are at the basement, trying to do the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy type stuff, trying to get your food, clothing, and shelter and your house together, okay, and your security in order, you're going to need to do some pollution, like the West did in order to get where it's at, like China did in order to get where it's at, like Russia did in order to get where it's at. But you know what? The IMF comes in, it gives you money, and it says, no, you can't do the things the way you do at the basement. You got to do the things the way we say you do in the penthouse. It's got to be green and woke and all these other kinds of things. Hence, the idea of this loans and the IMF involvement, I always look at with a great deal of skepticism. Okay, now that's just a little bit of projection on my part. He didn't say that was the plan, to tie Africans' hands in terms of development and whatnot. But this is what often happens de facto, ladies and gentlemen. So, as is usual in the case of the United States, there's going to be some lip service paid to the concept of democracy. Let's help you democratize. Let's give you a few $1 million, a few billion or whatever here and there to help with elections. Okay. to help with elections and democratization, and let's give some lip service to democracy. Let's hear a little bit more about that, and then I'll come back and give some comments.
Surely don't. And the work of democracy is never finished or never guaranteed. It's about consistent and constant self-improvement. But that's why democracy is the best tool we have to address the wide range of challenges we all face. And that belief is shared by Africans and Americans alike. For South Africa's world-changing triumph over apartheid, to Nigeria's not too young to run movement, empowering a new generation of changemakers, to the record voter turnout in Zambia, where young people demanded a better future, we see over and over again that our greatest power is our people. So one of the commitments I want to highlight today is the investment in countering democratic backsliding through our new African Democratic and Political Transition Initiative. Collaborating closely with African governments, regional institutions, and civil society, my administration will work with the United States Congress to invest $75 million to strengthen transparent, accountable governance facilities, facilitate voter registration, support constitutional reform, and more.
Institutions of government, okay? And as I mentioned, these institutions ideally ought to arise from actual cooperation. I gave the example of you and your neighbor. This is something that is hardly understood by many people, whether it's the Pan-Africanists who just think that unity, okay, unity is the way. It's like, no, the best you can get is regional economic zones where you and your neighbor have actual interests. You and your neighbor decide the best way, ground up. We know about ground up and decentralization and all those kinds of things. It is the wave of the 21st century, right? Crypto is all about decentralization, okay? The idea of artificial intelligence is all about decentralization, okay? You and your neighbor, in a decentralized way, figure out what you need. And then out of that comes a structure that you need in order to build that fence or that well or that road that you guys need, okay? There is a particular structure, a particular supply chain, a particular means and methods of production that need to go into, and then the contract, right? The contracts and the institutions you guys form with each other are all a result of the fact that you built the road. You learned it as you built the road. So to come from a top-down, take a top-down modality and say, I'm just going to give lip service to democracy. I'm going to put 100 million here and 100 million there for voter registration and institutional reform, and nothing ever happens. It's ridiculous. Okay. You can't just come in and start telling the neighbor about LLCs and contracts and stuff when you guys haven't talked about the road that you need to build, what he has, what you have, what the best means of pulling your resources together would be, and what will be the best way of fostering such cooperations in the future. This is something that is rarely ever understood by most people who talk about institution building. Okay, but it's simple. It's about decentralization here. Now, let us continue here with the contrast in terms of comparing with China. Okay, because there is a theme here that I've been drawing through, which is like that America is a little patronizing in its way it talks about, well, I think that African Union belongs at the table. Well, you damn right it belongs at the table. Okay. And the African Union in itself should be like, well, I'm insulted. I'm going to build my own table. That's the whole idea. I build my own table. I deal with the people whom can deal with me. If my neighbor is here, let's say China, and we're going to form a way to build this road, and maybe my neighbor is getting the better deal right now. Maybe my neighbor is getting the better deal, but at least I'm at a table working with him, as opposed to somebody who tells me, you know what, you belong. I'm bringing you into the G20 and I'm going to say this and say that. So let's talk about this a little bit more. We have Miss Arikana, okay, whom was a former diplomat for AU, Arikana Chihombori. And she's going to lay down a little bit of the difference between the way America acts and the way China acts. Now, China is not perfect by any means. And we're going to talk a little bit about, for example, the fact that this conference did not have an agenda, that the African leaders, 49 heads of state, by the way, attended. Out of the 54 nations in Africa, 49 heads of state attended. They did not have an agenda in which they could give in any input prior to coming here. So let's go ahead and play a little bit of this, see what she has to say.
I think for the United States, and I'll repeat it, and I used to repeat it all the time during my tenure, what really is behind the failure of effective engagement with Africa is the disrespect of the Africans. That's where the problem begins. If we cannot accept, if the United States cannot accept Africans as equal partners, if the United States, for example, let's look at this particular meeting, this particular summit, there was no defined agenda. There has never been defined agendas whenever they meet with African countries as individual countries. It's always the United States setting the agenda, the United States setting the policies, and the United States telling the Africans about the policies. That is no way to have any meaningful engagement. If you take, for example, the FOCAC meeting that was held between China and...
FOCAC is the Forum on Chinese African Cooperation. Okay, that'll be the contrasting kind of framework, and they're more consistent over there in terms of, you know, giving the agenda up front, allowing the Africans to chime in on the agenda, and how we're going to build that fence type modality, as opposed to talking from on high about how I'm going to invite you over and how I think you belong at the table and you're going to get to the G20. It's like, dude, we cooperate on the ground level, doing things, and then the institutions and all those things are emanations that result from the way in which the things worked out. Okay. Oh, we have to import dirt from here. Hence, we need to make a deal with the next village over. We did not know that. We did not know that we needed this particular kind of dirt, okay, in order to kind of, regrade the surface of this road that we need to build between me and my neighbor, okay? We did not know that. So we did not know that we needed to add the next village over on this deal. The idea of a top-down modality is really stupid. Let's continue.
African heads of state, way in advance. The issues were clearly defined. The agenda was going to focus on trade. It was going to focus on aid. It was going to focus on investments. The African heads of states were engaged in the discussion, in the planning. The outcomes were clearly defined with a way forward in terms of follow-up. It was a fruitful meeting that addresses the issues that needed to be addressed between not only African countries individually with China, but also Africans collectively with China. There is no published agenda. There are no issues that have been presented.
Again, she's comparing the Chinese approach to the American approach, the Chinese approach, which is the one that makes sense to treat you and your neighbor. You treat your neighbor as an equal when you're going in there to strike a deal with him. You might want to get the better deal. Okay, that's not the point. It's not a point of like fairness and egalitarian. It's like, but when you go to your neighbor and you say, hey, I want to build this road, you're treating him as an equal, even though you are trying to get the better of the deal. And you might get the better of the deal for the next couple of years in the cooperation until the neighbor comes back and says, hey, you know what? I've made a better deal over here with this other guy here. And as a matter of fact, I don't think that the 25% that you're charging me makes sense. I think it needs to be something more like 10%. And then, oh, you guys renegotiate. So she's making that contrast between the way China has been operating, now raising the level up to 250 billion so far, versus the way America is operating, talking about, I'll give you 50 billion and I'll give lip service to democracy and I'll talk about the fact that you belong on the table and all that kind of stuff.
To the African heads of states, Africans have not been asked to engage in terms of creating the agenda and making sure that when the African heads of states come to Washington, the outcomes, the issues to be discussed are going to be meaningful outcomes with follow-up and deliverables that are going to be beneficial to both. It remains
deliverables and follow-up. Okay, all that remains to be seen, because remember, 2014 was the first summit and it didn't happen for another 8 years until now. And United States is scrambling, saying, hey, China is way, way, way ahead of us. Let's talk about the future and all that kind of stuff.
A one-sided conversation with the United States telling the Africans the agendas and the policies. The Africans are not on the table to discuss issues pertaining to us, wherein lies the problem. And the reason that continues to be the case, what underscores that is the disrespect for Africans. I repeated it.
Disrespect, that's her emphasis.
I complained about it repeatedly. It is a serious problem. The United States must understand that Africans are not going to take it anymore. If you don't treat the Africans fairly, the United States is going to see itself slowly losing ground to China, to Russia, to all other nations, because without respecting the Africans, without treating the Africans as equal, without understanding that exploitation and abuse of Africa simply cannot continue. This meeting, this summit, is going to be yet another gathering with no outcomes, no deliverables until the next summit. I'm sorry.
No outcomes, no deliverables until the next summit, which may happen next year, 8 years, 10 years. $55 billion committed, 21 billion IMF loan, which always comes with strange conditions. And perhaps we'll follow up on that. We're going to follow up on the Congress as they make the appropriation for that loan. And we'll look at the conditions tied to it, because those conditions are often backbreaking for emerging economies. So, ladies and gentlemen, what are your thoughts about this? Okay. What are your thoughts regarding the ground up approach, which is the way to actually get things done in the world that China is doing, versus the top down approach that the United States is doing, where they pay lip service to democracy, they throw a few billion here and there, they tell you that you belong on the table. It's like, bro, okay, are we building this road? Are we building a well? What exactly are we doing? And are we going to cooperate to do this? Hey, you might screw me in the deal, but at least treat me as an equal when you come to me and you try to do something, okay, as opposed to using me as a pawn in your geopolitical chess game between yourself and the other powers, Russia and China. Okay, so what are your thoughts about this? Do you think that there will be follow through? Do you think that this is a genuine pivot that the United States is making? Do you think that future administrations will be able to follow through with this? Do you think that we will actually see that 55 billion and the 21 billion? And forget the lip service to about the $100 million for democracy. As I mentioned earlier, such notions of institution building does not work. You build contracts with your neighbor as a result of you guys building the road and figuring out that you needed X, Y, and Z as you go along building the road. There are things you did not know that you needed. You never know what you needed until you start cooperating, start moving through, you start figuring out, you start pivoting, you start course correcting. And out of that comes a structure of, oh, I guess we need an S Corp. I guess we need to hire an accountant. I guess we need to make a deal with the neighboring village to import that, special sand that they have. I guess we need to buy the water rights from these other people. And as a result, I think we need to make a 5-year kind of contract in this particular way. Without you going there and actually doing the stuff, building the road, investing in this case, after, America going in there, putting in the capital, making the investment, seeing how things work, and then structuring a set of structures and institutions and contracts that foster future cooperation of that sort, you will never go anywhere. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, go ahead and leave your comment. And don't forget to like. If you're not subscribed to the channel, go ahead and subscribe. One more time, I am Ike Ogiamin. Till next time, peace.